in a word, what does these four pictures depict? You're correct. It is to survey. What do these four pictures depict? Under monitoring. So this may be called surveillance. Okay. Good afternoon. Our lecture for this afternoon would be epidemiologic surveillance for preventive medicine and community health. Objectives for this afternoon would be to differentiate what is surveillance from survey, to enumerate and explain the principles involved in implementing surveillance, and to explain the different functions of surveillance and to give examples. So what is a survey? A survey is a brief interview or discussion with individuals about a specific topic or health issue. It is to collect information and is a study designed to collect information about a health issue and then analyze the collected information to draw a conclusion. Time frame, it's a specific point in time. Surveillance is the continuous, systematic collection, analysis, and interpretation of health-related data needed for the planning, implementation, and evaluation of public health practice. Time frame of surveillance is continuous. Is this survey or surveillance? So survey collects information on an event, and surveillance would collect information to detect the presence or absence of change in the same event through the passage of time, for example, disease trends. So this example would show surveillance because it shows dengue cases comparing 2014 and 2015 in different regions of the Philippines. So is this a survey or surveillance? A survey collects information on an event, as mentioned in the previous slides. Surveillance collects information to detect the presence or absence of change in the same event through the passage of time. So this one would also be surveillance since it looks at changes from 2009 to 2011 for number of dengue cases per month. Okay? So this would be the number of dengue cases per month from 2009 to 2011. And it would be enough for you to analyze and interpret the data. So this is another form of surveillance. Number of dengue cases per month in the Philippines. So again, surveillance is an ongoing systematic collection, analysis, and interpretation of health data essential for planning, implementing, and evaluating public health activities. It needs to be linked to timely dissemination of the data so that effective action can be taken to prevent disease. Compulsory notification regarding specific diseases, specific disease registries, continuous or repeated population surveys, and aggregate data that shows trends of consumption patterns and economic activity. It is generally considered the foundation of disease control efforts. It may either be passive surveillance, wherein physicians, clinics, laboratories, hospitals are required to report diseases that come to their attention. For active surveillance, it requires periodic telephone calls, electronic contact, or personal visits to the reporting individuals and institutions to obtain the required data. It is more labor-intensive and costly, so is seldom routinely done. The principles of surveillance include conditions for which surveillance can effectively lead to prevention. Surveillance systems should reflect the overall disease burden of the community. Other criteria for selecting diseases for surveillance would include incidence and prevalence, indices of severity, mortality, index of loss of productivity, medical costs, preventability, epidemic potential, and information gaps on new diseases. This would rely upon a routine system of reporting suspected cases within the health system followed by validation and confirmation. So what are the functions of surveillance? It is to establish baseline data and to evaluate time trends of secular or long-term trends, variation of seasons, and other types of variation, and to identify and document of outbreaks, surveillance for bioterrorism, or for example, surveillance for coronavirus, and evaluation of public health and disease interventions, so that we could set up disease control priorities and study the changing patterns of disease. So to establish baseline data, usual rates and patterns of diseases can be known only if there is a regular reporting and surveillance system. To study the patterns of diseases by the time and geographic location of cases and the characteristics of the persons involved. Continued surveillance allows epidemiologists to detect deviations from the usual pattern of data. Prompt to explore whether an epidemic is occurring or whether other factors are responsible for the observed changes. Secular or long-term trends are associated with some characteristic or phenomenon that is not cyclical or seasonal but exists over a relatively long period of time. So for example, a long-term increase in a disease, particularly when it is related to a single serotype, is usually of greater public health significance than a localized outbreak because it suggests the existence of a more widespread problem. So for example, this incidence of salmonellosis in the United States by year summarizes that an outbreak caused by contaminated pasteurized milk in Illinois sparked an increase in the cases in 1985. So the incidence rates, so this is in relation to use of toxoid. So this would be the reported cases and deaths per 100,000 population for tetanus. So it decreases because of the introduction of certain interventions. Seasonal variation. Variations in disease occurrence with periods of highest incidence usually depends on the route of spread. To determine the usual number of cases or rates of disease, epidemiologists must therefore incorporate any expected seasonal variation into their calculations. So this would be the number of dengue cases, and you will see that it would increase usually during rainy seasons. Other types of variations of health problems can vary by day of the week. So for example, this is your weekend migraine. So of course they would want to go out on a weekend. So they would excuse themselves from work every Sunday and Saturday. So it is important to identify and document outbreaks, such as in the coronavirus situation, because the occurrence of disease at an unusual rate or unexpected frequency is alarming. It is possible to determine that the level of a disease is unusual only if the usual rates of the disease are known and reliable surveillance shows that current rates are considerably elevated. For example, CDC uses a seasonally adjusted expected percentage of influenza and pneumonia deaths in the United States and a number called the epidemic threshold to compare with the reported percentage. So there's an actual proportion of deaths, and you will see the epidemic threshold in the dotted line, and there is a seasonal baseline. So you would see that there's an epidemic threshold, an alert threshold, with the morbidity cases presented usually. The most important need is for rapid detection of a bioterrorism threat. Special surveillance techniques are being developed to enable rapid detection of major increases in the most likely biologic agents. More rapid detection of epidemics and possible bioterrorism. Goal is to characterize syndromes that would be consistent with agents of particular concern and to prime the system to report any such syndromes quickly, rather than trying to establish a specific diagnosis before sounding an alert. This approach might provide early warning of a bioterrorism problem. So these are the usual agents of certain disease syndromes and their initial diagnosis, and to evaluate public health and disease interventions. The key principle here is the introduction of major interventions intended to change patterns of disease in a population, especially the introduction of new vaccines, should be followed by surveillance to determine if the intended changes were achieved. The failure of a vaccine to produce satisfactory immunity or the failure of people to use the vaccine can be detected by one of the following: a lack of change in disease rates, an increase in disease rates after an initial decrease as in the previous example of the polio vaccine, an increase in disease rates in a recently vaccinated group, the use of defective lots of inactivated polio vaccine in the 1950s. Evaluation of public health and disease interventions. With regard to medications, the importance of post-marketing surveillance was affirmed by the discovery of an increased incidence of cardiovascular events in people who took newly introduced COX-2 inhibitors. The discovery resulted in some COX-2 inhibitors being removed from the market. So this is important when you do surveillance in the pharmaceutical world, such that we could set disease control priorities. So data on the patterns of diseases for the current time and recent past can help government and voluntary agencies establish priorities for disease control efforts. This is not a simple counting procedure. A disease is of more concern if its rates increase rapidly, as with acquired immunodeficiency syndrome in the 1980s, than if its rates are steady or declining. The severity of the cases is a critical feature which usually can be established by good surveillance. For example, AIDS received high priority because surveillance demonstrated its severity and its potential for epidemic spread. Hence, the coronavirus has high priority in surveillance because it is a rapidly and deadly disease. It also aids in the study of changing patterns of disease. By studying the patterns of occurrence of a particular disease over time in populations and subpopulations, epidemiologists can better understand the changing patterns of the disease. So, for example, data derived from the surveillance of syphilis cases in New York City during the 1980s. So, when crack cocaine came into common use, proved valuable in suggesting the source of changing patterns of acquired and congenital syphilis. The reported number of cases of primary and secondary syphilis among women increased substantially beginning 1987. So both this trend and the concurrent increase in congenital syphilis were strongly associated with the women's use of crack and with their lack of prenatal care that allowed their syphilis to go undetected and untreated. So a new pattern of occurrence may be more ominous than a mere increase in the incidence of a disease. For example, tuberculosis in the US, incidence decreased steadily from 1953. However, yearly incidence began to rise again. This was associated with the increasing impact of the AIDS epidemic and the increased resistance of the bacteria to antimicrobial agents. This concern led to greater efforts to detect TB in people with AIDS and to use directly observed therapy to prevent antimicrobial resistance. TB rates peaked in 1992 when 26,000 cases were reported and then began declining again. So how do we create a surveillance system? The development of a surveillance system requires clear objectives regarding the diseases or conditions to be covered. So for example, infectious diseases, side effects of vaccines, etc. So the objectives for each surveillance team should be clear, including surveillance of an infectious disease, to determine whether a vaccine program is effective. The search for possible side effects of new vaccines or vaccine programs, determination of progress toward meeting health objectives. So the criteria for defining a case or a reportable disease or condition must be known to develop standardized reporting procedures and reporting forms. The types of analysis needed, potential life loss, and quality-adjusted life years should be stated in advance. In addition, plans should be made for disseminating the findings on the internet and in other publication venues. These objectives and methods should be developed with the aid of the investigators charged with collecting, reporting, and using the data. A pilot test should be performed and evaluated in the field, perhaps in one or more demonstration areas, before the full system is attempted. When it is operational, the full system also should be continuously evaluated. Thank you for listening to this lecture of surveillance. Please subscribe to our PMCH channel for more lectures on preventive medicine and community health training.